Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. My name is Carrie Bruce, and I am a board member for SID Washington. I'm going to be introducing you very briefly to our panel. It's a very diverse panel of speakers who will be discussing how organizations have adjusted their programming, workforce, and practices to try and bridge gaps across programming in health, education, funding, diversity, equity, and inclusion in light of COVID-19. First, our moderator will be Anastasia Marceau, who is the Managing Director of Accenture. She leads Accenture's development partnerships in North America, an impact consulting practice serving over 125 international NGOs, UN agencies, donors, foundations, and companies. Then we have our panelists. First, Krista Baptista, the Global Director for Center for Digital Acceleration at DAI. She leads DAI's work in digital development and manages the portfolio of digital projects for donors, private sector customers, and foundations. We also are honored to have Olya Catto, Vice President of Project Operations and Volunteer Programs at ACDI VOCA, who leads their business solutions and promotes continuous training and process improvement across their organization. Next, we have Todd Malone, who is the Managing Director of BroadReach Health Development, which is part of the BroadReach Group, where he leads their practice across all health programs. We also have Steve Knapp, the Director of Business Link Pacific and the New Zealand Country Director or Country Manager for DT Global. He leads DT Global's initiatives with the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Australia Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And we also have R. Drake Warwick, who is the Senior Project Director for Education in Conflict Division for Creative Associates International, where, as his job title suggests, he leads projects in the education and conflict sectors. I'll hand over now to Anastasia, who will guide the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Well, first, really delighted to be here. I'm glad so many people have decided to join us for this discussion. It's going to be a good one, and it's just so timely and relevant. This bridging the equality gap is something we're all thinking about and facing in terms of COVID. I just this morning read some startling statistics about how Oxfam finds the billionaires of the world have gained 4 trillion nearly in wealth, while low income workers, their lost wages combined, the ILO finds a very similar number of lost wages. And so when you look at just this widening gap and think about the vaccine availability and the challenges that we're seeing for so much of the world, this is really the problem of our times that we are all grappling with. And so maybe to kick off this panel, I'd like for each of the panelists to share, amongst all the challenges that your organizations are grappling with, kind of what's the one challenge that you wake up thinking about right now every day as you're thinking about how we respond and adapt and meet these increasing needs based on the COVID crisis. So I might start, Todd, with you over at BroadReach. Why don't you kick us off?
Great, Anastasia, thanks so much. And before I start, I really have to just say thanks to the SID Washington team for making this opportunity available. It's quite special to be able to speak to all of our colleagues around the world, and a special shout out to all of my my fellow colleagues around the African continent. I'm calling in from Cape Town, and I know it's a bit late for many of our colleagues here. For BroadReach, one of the things that we've really struggled with since the start of the pandemic is reaching clients within the health sector as the fear has increased. Initially there was a lot of misunderstanding. There was just a lack of, not even misunderstanding, a lack of understanding of how COVID was spread. And so in our work in doing HIV care and treatment work here in South Africa, we had to figure out how do we reach clients that are not coming to health facilities. And initially we saw we measure the number of people coming into facilities, looking at head counts on a monthly basis. And head counts dropped by about 50% when compared to the same time the previous year. And even today, head counts are down, about 20 to 25% in many of the districts where we work. And so one of the challenges that we had to address is figuring out, how do we reach these people that during a global pandemic are resistant to wanting to come into health facilities. And so one of the things that we really focused on was figuring out how we could use data and technology to identify where are those places where the numbers are dropping, what are the resources that are available both within the existing facility structure, and then how can we supplement that? So we get a lot of funding we get all of our funding in South Africa from USAID under PEPFAR, and so we have a huge cohort of staff. And so very quickly we were looking at how we could pivot and get our staff in a safe manner out into communities to figure out, to reach out to people and let them know that the facilities are open, that the services remain available, and that the frontline workers are there waiting for them and help them come back into the facilities. So let me pause there and hand back over, Anastasia. Thanks.
Yeah, no, this challenge of how do we reach our core constituents? There's lockdowns, people are afraid. I'm sure this is a theme we're going to hear echoed. Maybe Olya, I'll turn to you now at ACDI VOCA, as I know this is a challenge that you've been dealing with. How would you frame what's keeping you up at night?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for having me on this panel. It's a great honor to be with such esteemed colleagues talking about these important challenges. So as Carrie mentioned in her introduction, I actually have a dual role in my organization. I manage project operations and volunteer programs. And both of those functions have been challenged by the pandemic and the health crisis and the travel restrictions. But today, for the purpose of this session, I'm going to put on my volunteer programs hat because that is a unique area where we have encountered very unique challenges. And so that's something that I will focus on today. So our biggest concern when faced with this new reality, this new operational environment, was how are we going to continue to provide the much needed technical assistance to our local constituents, farmers, businesses, communities. Because we obviously relied a lot on international travel and having those volunteers in country to transfer knowledge and transfer technology. As soon as travel restrictions happened, we kind of panicked, like, what do we do? We were worried that, the biggest motivating factor for volunteers, travel and being in person, in these countries, once taken away, they would lose all motivation. And that's what we thought, but we were wrong. Actually, we ended up exceeding our goals for that project, for that activity. We grew an extensive network of volunteers. We enhanced equity and inclusion. And we ended up using technology in much broader, creative ways. And so I'm really looking forward to talking about those challenges and solutions in this session.
Yeah, the continuity of service delivery, and particularly when in so many parts of the world it is very face-to-face, in person, that actually leads me, maybe Steve, over to your organization, because there are many parts of the world that lack digital infrastructure, technology, where people are very affected and don't have other channels. So Steve, maybe if you might introduce some of the challenge that you're focused on.
Yes, thanks, Anastasia, and yep, good morning. I'm not sure if it's good morning where you are, but it's good morning here. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be part of such a fantastic international panel. Yeah, we DT Global New Zealand, we run a program for the New Zealand government in the Pacific Islands. It's an economic development program. So we work with small, medium enterprises in 8 small Pacific Island countries. And the focus of the program is business advisory services and the market for business advisory services at a local level. So we're working on both the supply side, the quality and appropriateness of advisory services all provided locally for small businesses, but also working with small businesses to help them to understand what business advisory services are available and how they can help their businesses to grow and expand. So, I mean, pre-COVID, we were able to show that, by running business diagnostics, finding out what businesses need, then connecting them up with appropriate business advisory services, that was helping those businesses to grow and expand and employ more people and driving that economic growth, even in very small island states. But of course, with the impact of COVID, lockdowns, travel restrictions, most of the small islands in the Pacific are very dependent on tourism as a main source of income. So suddenly small businesses that we were working with that were starting to experience some growth and starting to find their feet, found that their income dropped off to almost zero. So how do we support economic growth in an economy that has no income and has no growth? So and a disproportionate impact on smaller businesses, disproportionate impact on women in business, businesses that were already struggling to survive. We were quite lucky that from the outset, we worked from a small team based in Auckland, and we're very, very reliant on engaging with businesses through digital platforms. We did a lot of travel into the Pacific in the first couple of years and built up some really good partnerships at a local level. And the actual connectivity in the Pacific has increased quite dramatically over the last few years. A couple of undersea cables have come in. And we've seen a really big growth in the digital transformation of both businesses and people in general in terms of their connectivity. And that starts to address that tyranny of distance, which has always been really difficult for businesses in the Pacific to cope with.
Yeah, what a fantastic model there. And when you think about tourism, right, there's nothing more in person than the experience of going to visit somewhere. So to hear how the incomes of the businesses in these islands were impacted, what a challenge. I think this you mentioned about building up the digital capabilities over time, building that connective tissue. I think that maybe nicely lends me to introduce then Krista, which I know that's what you focus on every day within DAI, and thinking about how to make that inclusive. So I might hand it over now to you to frame how you're looking at some of these challenges.
Great. Thanks, Anastasia, and thanks to SID Washington. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with all of you today on this panel. I do think a lot about digital in my role at DAI, and studies that I've been reading have said that we have accelerated our digital transformation globally by 5 years in 2020. And that just has had a huge impact on how people are engaging with everyday sectors like health, education, and e-commerce, like we're hearing about today. People are more willing to use digital payments. Many of us have experienced the shift to online education that's happened around the globe, and vaccines access and the use of telemedicine, for example. And in a way, we are better prepared than ever before in the sense that digital connectivity has been on the rise. Our capabilities are growing globally. And many of us in our organizations were able to pivot quite quickly to remote work, to working at home. Having said that, we are also seeing that while many countries are prepared, there are many groups that are really at risk of being left behind. Economically disadvantaged groups, rural students, individuals with disabilities, those that are traditionally not included, such as women or indigenous groups. There was an example even in DevX just last week, an article about the India vaccine distribution, an app that was created to really make sure they could accelerate vaccine distribution. But since it was an app, they're leaving behind, many millions of people who don't have access to smartphones or don't have the digital literacy capabilities that they need to use that app. So, some of the things that we think about and that we've been trying to do on our programs are really around 3 priorities. One is making sure we're kind of doubling down on the principles for digital development, including design with the user, and using all the tools in our toolkit to understand what's happening with users on the ground. In Cambodia, for example, we are developing targeted, cyber awareness campaigns. We pivoting from, face-to-face community events to social media, making sure that we're conducting on-the-ground research into SMEs, similar, to what Steve was talking about, where we're understanding how digital tools are increasing resilience for SMEs, and where that they might be, holding them back if they don't have access, or what viable alternatives might be. And then secondly, making sure that we're designing tools that are flexible and multi-channel, where you can have both functionality to use an app or to call and speak to a human or put in your information through a voice system. And then lastly, thinking about leveraging the talent that we have around the globe, those human connections, and wrapping human connections around digital tools so that we can leverage all the people we work with around the world and the real expertise that exists to ensure that new tools will be successful and can accelerate opportunities for these disadvantaged groups, as opposed to sort of leaving them behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And this question, I think, is the focus of this panel. So thank you, of course, for raising that challenge, right? How do we make sure that digital inclusion really is universal? And so then, Drake, I'll lastly come to you in the work that you've been doing in education globally, but particularly in Africa. Please share. Drake, you're on mute still.
Sorry about that. It's great to be here with everyone. And thanks, Sid Washington, for putting on a very wonderful conference thus far. It's been great. In the education sector, Creative has a very robust portfolio. And like everybody has experienced and shared here today, at the onset of the pandemic, it really put things into a tailspin for a lot of programs, particularly around implementation and the strategy, the traditional approach we had in regards to implementing education programs in particular. And everyone has touched on how they've pivoted, had to make significant pivots in regards to their program designs and their delivery mechanisms about that. And Creative as well had to do that. We had to rise to the occasion to ensure that we mitigated, the impacts of school closures around the world and the learning loss and the capacity gains through training of teachers and so on that were made over time. And so we had to transition into the digital space as well. We had to adapt materials and curriculum into other formats, radio, television, and others. And as we did that, in Nigeria, in Morocco, and other places, we also had to give consideration about the opportunities that were presented throughout this process. And there were significant ones in regards to how organizations like Creative in the education sector spearheaded initiatives to develop new approaches and techniques in regards to the delivery of the education service, be it in the digital space, be it strengthening TV spots, lessons over radio and things of that nature, but also considering how to retain, sustain those initiatives over the long term, the strategic long term, not just re-engaging that back into the project as it recalibrates to a certain level of normalcy, but also in regards to the country strategy as well. A lot of organizations represented here in this panel have done tremendous things in a very short period of time in things that they weren't thinking about before, in regards to the implementation of programs. So one of the things that we've been giving time to is how do we retain those efforts? How do we ensure that those efforts are not lost, that they're not one-off exercises to ensure that the governments, the ministries of education, are better prepared to respond as needed or to continue very good services that have been developed in this time.
Great, great, important work. And there's a few themes that you all touched on that I think is worth coming back to. You know, every one of you talked about pivoting, adapting, restructuring, and I really want to draw out some of the stories you might share around how you were creative and innovative. And you all touched on digital, so I certainly want to hear how you're leveraging digital. But I want to bring out what Krista said about that human connection. And if there are non-digital elements that complement, I'd love to better understand that. And so just a few stories. And if there are pieces you want to keep, right? Some of these I think are stopgaps for a period of time, but if there's maybe to draw out one thing that you think that you've really learned and want to, sustain. So maybe we can even go in the same order as we did initially. So Todd, maybe, when you think about how you're working, particularly with the government, were there any kind of creative adaptations that you guys took forward? Any stories you could share on those learnings?
Sure. No, thanks, Anastasia. Listening to my colleagues, and everybody sitting in different parts of the world and doing, working in different sectors. And it's amazing how, how similar the stories are. I guess it's not surprising because everybody's living a very similar existence, it seems, these days. One of the things that I think about in terms of, what were some of the strategies we use that we would keep, it actually makes me reflect on a lot of the way that we feel that the work that we've been doing has been validated by COVID. And what I mean by that is that in all the work we do in the health sector, the speed with which you need data is just going faster and faster and faster. In the past, health issues were measured in months and years in many respects. And now with HIV, we're measuring in weeks, and now with COVID, we're measuring in days. And we need the information. We need it tremendously quickly. And when I reflect on what we've done, one of the things that we've done is we've worked very hard to engage with local government in the past and figure out how they can not just get data, but share data. And we have some work that we're doing out of our Kenya office, where we work on a regional data sharing project that USAID supports. And it's working with the East Africa and the West African health consortiums. And they've worked really hard in developing policies to go across multiple countries to figure out how they can collect data on cross-border vaccine management. There's a lot of mobile populations, and as we all know, mobile population numbers are going to continue to increase in the coming years and decades. And so figuring out how states can share their information across lines while also protecting that personal information. How do they de-identify it, but that allow them to share it so that they can respond to things exactly like what is happening right now. And so my takeaway has been, we must continue to engage with the end users from the beginning because they know what the needs are, and they will come up with some amazing solutions that we can work with them on. And we, unfortunately, we are, it's validated that there's this need to help control pandemics. But I think everybody knew that at one point or another, the sharing of information was going to be tremendously valuable. And so that's really been one of our takeaways.
Great. So really highlighting the importance of data, the speed, the accuracy, and the importance to come together with shared models to be able to share the data. Great learnings. Olya, help me understand how you guys pivoted with your volunteers in the wake and what you might sustain going forward.
Yes, well, we've talked about innovation for years. Innovation. It was a big buzzword, and a lot of energy went into that. But there's nothing better than a crisis to really kind of throw you into this hyper innovative mode. And so that's exactly what happened to us. In particular, for volunteer programs, most of our volunteers go to our host countries under the USAID Farmer to Farmer project. So one of the mandates of that project is the personal connection between US experts and their host organizations, businesses, farmers, and communities. And so we had to really come up with a creative approach to continue this human connection, this relationship building, in the absence of travel or when the whole infrastructure was disrupted. And so we had to get really creative and start thinking, like, what do we do? How do we promote the relationships while still delivering technical assistance on the ground? As you can imagine, it was a difficult year for everyone, but it was so much more difficult for some of our constituents with the disruptions in the value chains and health systems falling apart, lockdowns, you name it. And volunteers usually, it's a very affordable way to deliver technical assistance to those who need it. And so then we thought, why not try to find local volunteers, people on the ground, those experts who are on the ground, who are in those communities, in those business circles. Let's find them and let's pair them with US experts online, virtually. So there's still this transfer of knowledge, there's still this personal connection, but there's someone working with those businesses and those farmers on the ground to transfer knowledge and to transfer skills. I know that it sounds like a simple thing, but we've never thought about this before. This is a completely new approach. And I'm really happy to say that our donor was very supportive. They went along with it. We adjusted some of our programmatic goals, and we jumped into it. It was not easy because in some of the countries where we work, local volunteerism is not very common. It's not a thing the same way that it is in the US, for example. And it took us a while to establish a network of local volunteers, and our field teams were extremely helpful in that regard. But we were able to find people on the ground who were willing to volunteer. And so we provided lots of training, technology training. We used every possible platform that we could get a hold of and that could be used in those geographies, WhatsApp, Skype, Zoom, Teams, you name it. We just really embraced it, and it worked. It really worked. And so in terms of what we're going to keep, we still think that in-person volunteering is probably most impactful, both for the volunteer and for the host organization. So we will not completely move to the online option, but we will definitely continue with this hybrid model where when appropriate and when efficient and effective, we will use virtual volunteers, and we will develop the technology around it, and we'll develop the business processes around it, and we will absolutely move it into the future because it has worked so well this past year for us.
Thank you for sharing that story. That's I think we can all really picture the situation that you were in and the new capabilities and processes to now recruit these local experts, even to identify who they are, make contact, and this idea of you embrace this idea of learning by doing and trying different things and adapting and readapting. It's so important for those of us embracing kind of innovation. So it's great to hear that you think there's value in this blended approach, which we certainly work with many organizations on these kinds of blended models, because the ability to reach scale and have a lower overall per unit cost, can be really, really powerful. So I do love that story. Thank you. Okay, well, Steve, maybe now over to you. I'm sure you also had to work with your businesses about how they adapt and readapt. And now that we're going into reopening of tourism, I'm sure there's a lot of new challenges that you're starting to work with. So maybe over to you for a story.
Yeah, thanks, Anastasia. Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, as travel restrictions started to bite in the Pacific and the tourists disappeared, you know, a lot of businesses went into crisis very quickly, you know, almost overnight. And we saw a massive spike in demand for business advisory services. You know, businesses needed support quite desperately, but also at a time when they were least able to be able to pay for that support. And, you know, our approach previously had been very much a market systems approach, you know, encouraging the market for business advisory services. But suddenly when the ability of SMEs to pay dropped off very sharply, yet their demand for those services increased dramatically, you know, we had to pivot quite quickly and look at how we were going to support that. And you know, luckily the New Zealand government were very supportive of that pivoting and changing and looking at how we could reallocate budgets to make sure that we were responding to the needs and the demand for services on the ground. So we were able to you know, launch a new online tool which focused on business continuity planning. You know, shift some of the services that we were providing that were focused on business growth to business continuity and survival, and you know, how do we support businesses through this crisis? And you know, a big demand for services looking at renegotiation of bank debt, HR issues with you know, employees being furloughed, you know, even right through to businesses having to have their financial accounts and tax returns up to date to be able to access government support schemes and wage subsidies, etc. So a lot of services were needed very quickly, and you know, we saw a massive spike for that. But you know, because we have that online connection with several thousand businesses in the Pacific, we were also able to get that data and get some information around what business needs were very quickly. And you know, one of the things we saw that businesses were desperately in need of finance. So we were able to talk to the New Zealand government very quickly. We put a design together for what we called the SME finance facility. And, you know, within 3 months, we got the design done. We managed to get it through the government approval processes. And we signed a contract in November last year for SME finance facility with the New Zealand government. And that enabled us to launch a program of adaptation grants, where we can give businesses small grants to help them adapt to the crisis, you know, look at things that they need to do with, you know, tourism reopening, renovations of properties, you know, preparing for tourists to come back, a lot of that kind of thing, but also a lot of e-commerce projects where businesses looking to move to digital platforms, a lot of challenges in the Pacific around online payments and those sort of things that we have to navigate. And then the second phase of that, looking at concessional lending to help businesses through to the recovery phase. And you know, we're working with a number of banks across the Pacific to you know, place some wholesale capital that's come from the New Zealand government that they can then on lend at concessional rates to SMEs to try to support the recovery process. So we were you know, we were really lucky to be able to respond very, very quickly in that way. And then I think, you know, a couple of things that we will definitely keep going forwards, the network of business advisory service providers that we've built across the Pacific, with consultants, you know, international consultants unable to travel to the Pacific at the moment. There's that self-reliance is coming forward, those local business advisors, you know, through our quality approved network. We're finding lots of other programs and donors are tapping into that network to get work done that perhaps, you know, they would use an international consultant for previously. So, you know, we think that's maybe a positive change that could come out of COVID. And also, you know, we're really pleased to see this as almost a proof of concept of, you know, our approach to using digital platforms, but also developing very close partnerships on the ground. And, you know, going back to what Krista was saying, that's the really important aspect of our digital approach has been that there's also a face-to-face person at the Chamber of Commerce that businesses can go and see, and also, you know, interact online with us through the digital platforms and services that we've got.
Yeah, so it's interesting how in a different sector, I'm hearing a number of themes that have been raised around the local connections becoming so important, this idea of a potential blended model being really important. And I also think it kind of ties back, Todd, to what you were saying around the importance of data and being able to aggregate data across a region and provide that to stakeholders in real time being so critical. So wonderful continuation of some of those themes. Krista, over to you for, you're looking at a macro level. How are you? What story might you tell?
Sure. Everything that everyone has said really resonates with my experience for the last 18 months and what we've seen at DAI. And I will say, we are a large organization. We're in about 100 countries. We have 150 projects, but I've never felt more like part of a global company than the last 18 months. And I think that the increased use of digital tools have really helped that. But also, I think the fact that everyone is working, remotely, or it really has leveled and created kind of even deeper connections across our organization. So I'll kind of talk about it at that level. I think that we are building these connections with our country offices, with our employees that are based around the world. And it's really been about listening and mobilizing people where they are and kind of where we can pull them in on projects. For example, we are conducting some research in Nigeria and developing recommendations around digital technology policy and digital transformation and how to include citizens in that process. And so the way we're doing that is by bringing together, of course, people in Nigeria, our employees there, our staff from CDA, from our center, and a team based in Europe that is, because it's also looking at it from the viewpoint of how Europe can be engaged in this process and can support this process. So it's really just an example of how we're able to bring all these pieces together and leverage DAI overall and work on really important projects. And I think that's something we'll keep. I think that we have shown and demonstrated to ourselves that we can do this, we can innovate in this way, and the foundations are in place and the structures are in place. I think that's the other thing is the mindset and the structures have been cemented now through this process and will be carried forward.
Yeah, I've definitely heard echoes of this sentiment around becoming more connected with global colleagues. We support a number of implementers, and we're seeing so many of the INGOs starting to really feel part of this global community where before they were maybe thinking about their country or their region. So I think that's a really interesting point that you raise. And then, it's interesting, your model as well as Olya's and Steve, yours as well, has this what I might call global kind of element, this global local collaboration. And that seems to be a macro kind of theme, perhaps out of this panel in terms of some of what the pandemic instigated in a way by, never waste a good crisis, to Olya's point. But, there are these pieces that maybe there's some new learnings and some new areas where we can have collaboration with new insights that we might not have realized before. So thank you for raising those. And then, Drake, when we think about the education sector and so many stakeholders from the Ministry of Education to the students to the educators trying to adapt and take on new technology, I'm sure you have many stories to share, but why don't you pick one from your work to share with us now?
Yeah, it is definitely a challenge to pivot in a contextual way throughout the portfolio of projects that we have. And I think one of the things to highlight as we try to do that is the effort to expand access to, as we're pivoting to education, and adapt to the delivery mechanism that we have to work with now when the traditional form is not there anymore. And so one of the ways that we did that in Morocco is the development of our sign language programming that went along with the television programming to ensure that service delivery to the children in the country was made available, but also was inclusive of the deaf and hard of hearing in part of our support efforts. And what that kind of shows is that before we were working towards developing teaching and learning materials kind of solely, but we have to expand the format of our content now. That's what we really have had to do, is expanding the content, the formats of that content, to be available to expand the access of the learners, of the teachers, when it comes to lessons being taught on radio, on WhatsApp lessons, audio stories being delivered and things of that nature, capacity building of teachers and so on. We have to expand the content format and how we deliver that. And that's one of the things that we will continue to do. Is it's no longer just a set portfolio of teaching and learning materials and we're good to go. We also now need to be thinking about, are we going to deliver this in the digital space? Are we going to ensure that radio programming is available and so on? And again, this goes back to thinking about the long-term strategic position of an education country strategy and being able to work towards that so that governments are in a position to sustain these types of interventions moving forward.
Great. No, I love that story because it really brings the point around inclusion to life that, Krista was making earlier. And we think about adoption of digital technology, but you really took a step back and thought about which students may not have access, may not be getting the educational content. So this expansion of formats and content that's just, even without COVID, I imagine that expansion serves all kinds of learners, which is amazing. So I know we have about 10 minutes before we'll switch over to question and answer. So I have one question for the group before then, and it's really coming back, Drake, to what you said about sustain and how, of course, we all need resources and investment to sustain some of these approaches. And you all in your discussions have talked about different bilateral donors you're working with, local public sector you're working with, as partners or funders. And so I'd love just to hear maybe a lesson learned or a piece of advice for the folks that are watching in terms of how you've been able to reshape that relationship, get the flexibility, and really think about investing for the future. So Todd, we'll start with you again.
Great, thanks, Anastasia. I love listening to what everybody's doing. I'm kind of, my mind's going in lots of different directions, listening to everybody on the panel and what they're talking about. It's lovely. In terms of sustaining the work, I mean, one of the things that, I made a note about it while we were talking, one of the things that's really changed in my mind that we've been working on sustaining with our partnership with the various local governments we work with is really this idea that what a frontline worker is. When we started off, we would think of frontline workers as those providing providing clinical care within a health facility. And that has changed significantly. It's everybody in the health facility, from the cleaners to the receptionists to the security, and really importantly and surprisingly is the data workers, if you will, those that are helping enter the information that helps drive our programming. We have teams working on software development in Zambia, working with the Ministry of Health there, trying to help develop it's called Smart Care Plus, but it's working with CDC and with the Ministry of Health there to get basically electronic health records, widespread use across Zambia, and ensuring that information is up to date to improve clinical care as well as to improve planning for the Ministry of Health. And in the past, we wouldn't have thought of the people as developing software as frontline workers, but the teams go out into the field. They go out into facilities because they have to install it. They've got to get the servers up and running. They've got to configure the systems. They've got to make sure it's working. They've got to test it and do quality assurance. And then there has to be people entering the data from the government as well as from various partners supporting them. And so it's really helped shape our thinking around the idea of digital transformation within the health sector and what that looks like. Because I think beforehand, the focus a lot would have been on the kind of back end of the technology and maybe the interface. but not at facility level and what that looks like and who needs to be out there to support that and to make sure that happens. And so that really helps us in our conversations and our engagements with our local government colleagues and helping them understand how they can drive improvements across the health sector by ensuring that they look at what are the essential, let's say, building blocks of digital transformation within health. And that to me has been really a kind of a revolutionary thought that's come out of, or practice that's come out of our experience over the past year.
Yeah, so it sounds like working with your donors around some of those infrastructure investments, EHRs, but also really understanding those human connection point and the roles all kinds of frontline workers are playing to make this real. Amazing. Olya, any quick thoughts from your side?
Yes, I'll be quick. When I think about sustainability of this hybrid volunteer approach, I'm thinking two key aspects. One is the sustainability of this business model for our organization, working with our donors. And the other one is the sustainability of this work on the ground. How is this going to continue when we return to the new normal? So in terms of the business model, I don't think I have to convince my leadership or our donors about the benefits of it. It's cheaper. It allows us to include more women, more persons with disabilities, more people of color. It is good all around for us. On the local sustainability level, it is incredible to have promoted this whole network of local volunteers in the industry, because obviously they know better what the local conditions and what the businesses and farmers need. They not only bring most suitable solutions, but they will continue these relationships into the future, well beyond our project is over. So I really don't see any drawbacks to this. So of course, sustainable.
Amazing. And it is wonderful to hear, the flexibility that you experienced with your donor. Steve, you might build on that. I know you already shared a bit about the New Zealand SME facility that you mentioned, but how was your experience and how do you think the donor relationships going forward can help sustain some of these gains?
Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of challenges that we face in the Pacific. I mean, particularly around connectivity and reaching the harder to reach groups, and we've really had to focus our gender and social inclusion lens to make sure that we are reaching beyond those easy to reach partners, and that's something that New Zealand MFAT's been very supportive of, and something that we've got some expertise within DT Global around gender and social inclusion. But I mean, in terms of the kind of longer term sustainability and looking at the recovery phase going forward, I mean, we're still very much coping with a crisis phase in the Pacific, but we're starting to think about recovery, and access to finance is going to be a big issue as businesses start to come into a recovery phase. I mean, very often as businesses start to open up, cash flow becomes an issue. And you see business failures in that recovery phase, just because access to finance is difficult. And DT Global's been working on another program with the New Zealand government that we've been designing for a little while now, called Invest Pacific, which is leveraging private investment into investable projects, business projects in the Pacific region. The SME finance facility, again, is looking at that recovery phase, looking at how businesses can better access finance, and working very closely with the banks and financial institutions in the Pacific to really see how small businesses can better access loans and in order to grow. But businesses in the Pacific also, there's an education piece. I mean, often businesses look at debt and finance as a way to get through a crisis, rather than to look at finance as a way to grow the business. And that's where a lot of business advisory support and access to business advisory services is really important to be able to facilitate that economic growth. Once we get out of this COVID crisis that's really hampering you know, any kind of economic activity in the Pacific at the moment.
Great. So it sounds like a number of aspects, right? Helping your businesses really shift their mindset to more of an investment mindset. You're working with your traditional partners like the New Zealand government, but also expanding a bit to new sources of capital, private finance banks. And I love, again, this emphasis around the hard to reach inclusion. So thanks for sharing a bit about your plans. Krista, I know at DAI you work closely, of course, with USAID and their digital strategy and looking more at an ecosystem level. How do you think from that lens we might be able to sustain some of these advancements around digital?
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about, the digital transformation that is happening, that is sort of part of our lives, we do think that taking a digital ecosystem approach is one path to sustainability. So really, it's highlighted in the USAID strategy. We've seen other donors also thinking similarly about how can we move from this focus on platforms and data as a sole set of activities to really looking at the larger ecosystem in a geography and thinking about the policies, enabling environment, the entrepreneurship opportunities, the infrastructure for investment, things like that we've been speaking about on this panel, for example, and factoring that into the way that we design programs, the way that we design tools, the things that we've been talking about, engaging users and creating sustainable and flexible tools will be possible if we've taken this ecosystem approach. Not just possible, but they'll be sustained because they're embedded in that ecosystem that exists, and that's going to continue to transform and digitally transform.
Yeah, so really thinking about that enabling environment, that holistic environment is key. So Drake, I'll let you have the final word here. And you, of course, have the hard job of working with the local Ministry of Health, or Ministry of Education, excuse me, with your program, and then we'll turn to questions. Over to you.
Thank you. Everybody has touched on a relevant point that is applicable in the education sector for sure. With the innovations that we've been able to develop, the issue is transferring those to the ownership and management of the Ministry of Education. We continue, as we have for years, to do capacity development of the human resource, invest in the infrastructure and the organizational aspects that are required. But just the aspect of managing the digital content that we've developed itself is a challenge for many ministries of education. And so we continue to work with them in regards to their strategic planning and budgeting practices and so on to ensure that resources, funds are available when they need to be in regards to these investments is very important. So that's an ongoing process and effort to ensure that we are able to sustain a lot of the innovations that we have developed over the past 18 months to respond to the COVID pandemic. So we continue to do that.
You're on mute, Anastasia.
You're on mute, Anastasia.
I knew it was going to happen one time. Thank you all. Just commenting how certainly building capacity within the public sector is a long journey, but when we think about sustainability, of course, nothing can be kind of more critical to really building that skill set for the future. And so I see we have 7 minutes left, about 160 folks in this session. Thank you so much for your attention. I know we have had a number of questions stream through the chat, so we'll touch on as many of them as we can in this time. The first one I'd like to pose really speaks to the end user experience. I know many of you touched on this. Todd mentioned it explicitly. Olya, you spoke about the farmers and their interactions, Drake, the students, and then the small business owner, Steve. Have you asked them what their experience has been with these new digital channels and ways of working? And what has been some of the feedback from the end user perspective? And so just raise a hand if anyone would like to chime in on this one.
I can take that one really quick for our volunteer programs. So yes, we did ask them. Of course, we need to get feedback all the time from our constituents just to make sure we're effective. And they have loved it because not only do they get the expertise of the international advisor with the best practices and sort of the top-notch technologies coming in, but they have someone who is available to them at any time locally to provide that technical assistance. Yes, technology can be a challenge. as you all know, technology works beautifully until it doesn't. And sometimes where we work, technology can be expensive and not accessible. So we again have had to get creative, re-recording messages, using just really simple cell phones, and all sorts of training. But at the end, it worked. And we have nothing but positive feedback from our end users. So that's one of the motivating factors for us to continue.
Okay, Drake, go ahead.
Yeah. So just quickly, similar experience in regards to being able to reach parents, students, as well as teachers in the delivery of training materials, the audio messages or the audio books that I was mentioning before have all seen success, and a demand has risen for the continuation of these types of services and content. So it's been tremendous.
Great. Steve, want to have the final word on this question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of user testing of online platforms, and get a lot of feedback from users, and also monitor who's using male, female usage, rural, urban usage, etc., to see how accessible those online platforms are. And I think it's also interesting that we've seen country by country, there's a difference between whether people really have that uptake of online interaction. And interestingly, Papua New Guinea, for instance, we have very strong online engagement with businesses in Papua New Guinea, and then maybe somewhere like Samoa, where people prefer that face-to-face contact, and we have more interaction through our representative in the Chamber of Commerce. It's interesting also culturally how people interact with the online experience.
Yeah, no, the cultural dimensions are particularly salient across all of our markets that we're working in. The next question, speaks to the role of data. Many of you mentioned how critical data is, particularly through this accelerated, adaptation of models and pivoting and so forth. And so the question is a bit broad, but I'd love each of your takes on, from where you sit, what are the biggest challenges or gaps within the data ecosystem for development are you grappling with? Todd.
I'll be happy to start on that one, if that's all right, Anastasia. Okay. One of the biggest challenges we face, we talk about the data pipeline. So as soon as a service happens, that's when the data pipeline starts. So getting the clinical work written up correctly, and then getting it transcribed into format that the data entry clerks can put into the system, and then the system uploading. And then being able to pull that information out in a de-identified way, and then turn it into usable data, and then getting it back into the field. Really, one of the most difficult things is just that initial step in the data pipeline after services happen, is because if you can't get that information in a quality format, everything kind of breaks down afterwards. And so having the quality assurance built in, having all of the the different data checks, the various mechanisms, is a tremendous challenge. And that was hard before COVID. And then when you have limited travel to go out and do those data audits and provide the oversight and support to the teams to make sure the tech is working, that is, it's quite a feat that we do get the volume of data we get, given all of the challenges across the pipeline that people face.
Yeah, so that data capture in the analytics and serving it back. And would anyone like to add another comment to that? I do know we're here in our final moments. Yes, Krista?
I would just add, I think that once you get all that right, which as Todd was talking about is really challenging, then making sure that we are using the data and making sure that it's getting back to the people also who need it in the geographies where we work. So that kind of decision making around data is still, I think, for our sector, really a work in progress and something we need to keep focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. How are we making data useful at the point of decision making in real time to those people, whether they're frontline health worker at a ministry level or a global donor. I couldn't agree more, Krista. Well, I know we are here in our final moment. I'd like to first thank Sid for inviting me to join. I've really enjoyed this. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for your candid thoughts, such a rich sharing of experiences and a dialogue. And I'll maybe just end with sort of 4 sort of meta themes that I picked up over this whole hour that I'm going to take forward, and I hope many listening will consider. First is inclusion, and that has to be built in by design from the beginning. And so thank you for so many stories on that. Data, the power of data, real-time data, thinking about how you're going to use it and embed it. This local-global connection, I think, is a really key, kind of rising to the fore, and the new opportunities that are emerging. And then lastly, from a go-forward approach, some of the opportunities through these blended models that many of you are touching on. I'm really excited to see how those continue to take shape in our sector. So I think with that, thank you all. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks. Bye-bye.